Detectives were at a loss. The woman who was their main suspect had been out of town at the time of the murder. But everything they thought they knew would change when the medical examiner took a closer look at the forensic evidence. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. Yoga instructor Michael DeHockes was a favourite with his students. People who came to his classes liked his style of teaching. They enjoyed his kind, open-hearted nature and the way he delivered the sessions. This made him one of the most popular teachers at the local yoga school where he was practicing in Tucson. 45-year-old Michael was living his best single life. He'd recently divorced and had 2 children, Vanessa and Brianna, who he doted on. He was a charming and kind man and would be a friendly face to anyone new starting at the local yoga school. On Friday, the 26th of September 2003, yoga students were arriving at the school where Michael worked, ready for their first lesson of the day, which was scheduled to be taught by him. But as the time of the class started and there was no sign of Michael, the students began to become concerned. It was very unlike Michael for him to miss a session, and it was even more unlikely that he wouldn't let any of his students or his boss know. So at this point, people were getting concerned. Michael's boss, who knew that he was seeing a woman who lived quite close by, went to this woman's house to see if Michael was there and to see what was going on. This woman, Amber Trudel, was a student of Michael's, and she was in her mid-20s. But when Michael's boss arrived at Amber's house, there was no sign of Amber. In fact, it appeared that no one was in the house at all. All of the curtains were closed and there was no car in the drive. It turned out Amber had decided to take a trip out of town. She'd actually gone to visit some of her extended family and she had left the day before on the Thursday morning. Meanwhile, across town, a heavy police presence gathered outside of Michael's house. At 6 a.m. that morning, a neighbour of Michael's had been walking past his house when they'd come across a horrifying scene. They found Michael lying on his back outside his house on the front porch area, and he was dead. His body was warm to the touch, and so investigating officers assumed that he hadn't been dead for long, but they would have to wait for the medical examiner's report to come in to know for sure the estimated time of death. Because Michael's house was set slightly far back from the path and he was found on the floor in the porch area, it was quite likely that no one would have seen Michael if his neighbour hadn't walked past. There was no way someone just walking past on the road would have seen him, and that meant it was likely there'd be no eyewitnesses to what had happened. During the initial scope of the scene, officers found that the front door was slightly open and there was a smashed window on the ground floor. Immediately, officers thought this could be a burglary. Michael was found with a single gunshot to his head and that door was open, so it seemed to add up that a burglary was at this point the most likely motive. It was also known that Michael was a keen musician. He had a number of expensive items, including lots of guitars and microphones, and so the thought at this point was that any burglars that had come in had attempted to steal some of the expensive music equipment that they would then go on and sell for cash. But the officers did note that a lot of the more expensive items, musical items, were still in and around the house, and this could have been for a number of reasons. It could have simply been that the intruder or intruders had come in, they had had a fight with Michael, ended up killing him, not thinking that they would do that, and then panicked and simply fled without actually gathering any of the items they'd come in for. With that, they started doing door-to-door questioning of the nearby area, and it wasn't long before they came up with 2 names of 2 people who were known in that area for committing burglaries. The 2 men, David Wynn and Joseph Keyes, were regular drug users who had both been previously arrested for burglaries. Both men completely denied having anything to do with Michael's murder, but their house was just under a mile away from Michael's. Based on the information that the officers had and the fact that both David and Joseph lived under a mile away and they had previously been arrested for burglaries in the same area, the police did manage to get a warrant to search their house. Inside that house, they found a pair of bloody shoes. Now, when Michael was found, he was covered in blood, and the thought was that whoever had killed him would have had some blood transfer on them. So this seemed like a really good first step in attempting to solve his murder. And so the shoes were taken for forensic testing, But shockingly, the blood on those shoes was not a match to Michael, and in fact, we never found out whose blood that was on the shoes. We just know that it wasn't Michael's. On top of that, the detectives had found a pair of jeans that belonged to either David or Joseph, they weren't sure who, and on those jeans there was a substance that they thought was potentially blood, and so they sent it off for forensic testing. But when those results came back, they found out that it wasn't blood, it was just some sort of chemical, and so with nothing else on David or Joseph, they had to let them go. Unfortunately, the officers were at a bit of a dead end by this point. They hadn't gotten a huge amount of information from the scene, and there were no eyewitness accounts of what had happened that day. But when they looked at Michael's phone, they found a number that kept cropping up over and over again, and the last number he called belonged to Amber. The lead detective called Amber, but she didn't answer, so he actually left her a message and asked to call him right back. She never did call him back, but the officers found out where she worked. She was an accountant, and so they headed to her place of work. When they arrived at Amber's work, her boss greeted them and said that they're really sorry, but they couldn't help. Amber wasn't in, and she hadn't been in since the previous Wednesday. She'd actually gone on an emergency family visit on the Thursday morning, and he hadn't heard from her since. The fact that she left town on the Thursday morning was quite satisfying to officers in terms of her not being able to have anything to do with the murder, as it had happened on the Friday morning. But police were only satisfied with that for a short time, because they soon learnt from Amber's boss that she'd gone out of town with her husband, Justin Goodwins, to visit his family. Even though Amber was married, it quickly became clear to officers that she hadn't told anyone in the yoga classes that she had a husband, and they were all under the impression that she and Michael were dating, and they were pretty happy dating. Amber and Michael had met when Amber came in to take some group yoga classes that Michael was instructing on. After that, she asked him for one-to-one lessons and he agreed, and it wasn't long before they soon became romantically involved. Detectives immediately looked into Amber's husband, Justin, as a possible suspect. They theorised that perhaps he'd found out about the affair and dealt with Michael in the most brutal way. The problem was, he'd also been out of town by the time that Friday morning had rolled around, and Michael was found dead. They tried to go and visit Justin at his job at a bagel shop, but he wasn't working that day. His boss said Justin had had to drive back to his stepdad's place to go and pick Amber up. She'd stayed behind a couple of extra days. And then the lead detective got a phone call from Amber's boss, who said that they'd been passing Amber's house and they'd noticed a house moving van outside, just parked outside. They'd looked inside the van and they'd seen who they thought was Justin, Amber's husband, packing up the car with all of their belongings. Officers rushed out to the house straight away, and when they arrived there, they actually arrested Justin. And when Justin was arrested, he was found to be carrying a gun, and on first glance, it looked as though that gun could potentially match the murder weapon. When they were questioning Justin, he informed officers that he'd only just got back from his stepdad's and he'd actually gone to pick Amber up and he'd brought her back to town. But he said he didn't know where she was right now. The marriage wasn't good. They were actually getting a divorce. But he swore he hadn't known about the affair between her and Michael. He said he'd been aware of affairs that she'd had before, many of them, but he didn't know about this one until right now. Justin went on to say that the reason they'd travelled out of town and gone to see his parents was because Amber had arrived home really early hours of Thursday morning at around 2:30 a.m. and she'd been really upset, she'd been emotional, and she'd been drunk. And she said she'd done a really bad thing. She wouldn't tell him exactly what she'd done or what was wrong. She just said she needed some time and that she wanted to get out of town. And that's when they decided to get out of Tucson and go and visit his parents. And then officers got a break when one of Michael's good friends, Eli, came to them with some new information. He said that the night before the murder, the Wednesday night, Michael and Amber were out with him. Michael and Eli had spoken about his relationship with Amber a number of times before that night, and Eli thought that the pair just didn't seem like they would work. They were completely different people. Michael, like his friends, was incredibly social and outgoing, whereas Amber preferred to stay in. She was much quieter than the group and she seemed to keep herself to herself, and if anything came off as standoffish. Michael and Amber had been out for dinner and then they'd gone onto a bar to have some drinks, and that's when they'd met Eli. He'd joined them for some drinks. But the night took a quick turn for the worse when Michael and Amber started arguing. The pair were arguing on and off all night, to the point where Michael said that he'd had enough, he didn't want to deal with this, and he actually left the bar, and then Amber went out and followed him. Eli didn't know exactly what happened in that conversation outside, but the pair seemed to make up and they came back into the bar to join Eli again. They headed to another bar, and Eli said by this point both Michael and Amber had seemed to calm down a little bit. He said he left at around 10 p.m. and Michael and Amber stayed for some more drinks until around midnight. This was really useful information to officers. They knew that the last known sighting of Michael had been on that Wednesday night when he, Heather and Eli were in that bar. And detectives became suspicious when they learned that Michael hadn't attended any of his classes on the Thursday of that week. This was odd to everyone that knew Michael. They knew how devoted he was to teaching yoga, and it was very, very suspicious that he hadn't turned up for that whole day. It was unlikely that he would miss one class, let alone a whole day of classes. But we know that his body was found on the Friday morning at 6 a.m. and we know that it was warm, suggesting that he'd only been killed hours, if not minutes, earlier. But the officers got another break in the case when the medical examiner's report came in. It concluded that the original finding that Michael had probably died sometime just before 6 a.m. on that Friday morning was incorrect, and in fact, he'd likely died hours before. The reason that his body was found to be warm, or to feel warm, was because it was so hot outside. The morning air was warm, not necessarily his body. The medical examiner also concluded that Michael had ophthalmomyosis, which is when maggots infect the eyes, and that is something that happens much later after death, much more than just a few hours. And so those two new pieces of information, along with a number of other things, meant that the medical examiner changed the time of death from just before he was found at 6 a.m. on that Friday to any time between 10:30 p.m. and 3:30 a.m. on the Wednesday night, Thursday morning. This changed everything. And obviously now, Amber was the main suspect in this case. Obviously, with this revelation, the investigating officers needed to speak to Amber urgently, but no one could locate her. There was a real worry that she had fled Tucson. She wasn't in any of her usual haunts, she wasn't at her house, and Justin said that he had no idea where she was. And at this point, officers are actually worried that Justin might have harmed Amber in some way, and that's why they couldn't find her. But whilst Justin was in that interrogation room, the officers had confiscated his phone, and the person who had confiscated it kept seeing a number pop up on the phone, and that number was traced back to a motel. The officers thought that if Amber was going to be anywhere, it was likely in that hotel, if she was still alive. The officers made their way to that motel and they arrived. They asked the receptionist if they'd seen anyone matching Amber's description, and the receptionist said that yes, they had. They directed the officers to the room in question. The officers knocked on, Amber opened the door, and she was immediately taken down to the station. Whilst questioning Amber, one of the detectives asked her where her gun was, and she said she didn't know. Now, before this, Justin had already told them that he knew Amber always kept her gun in her handbag, but they checked the handbag and it wasn't there, and she said she had just misplaced it and she couldn't tell them where it was because she didn't know. Obviously, the officers didn't believe her, but they didn't have a whole lot to go on and she hadn't given them any new information, so they had no choice but to let her go. It wasn't long after that, however, that the officers at Tucson Police Department got a call, and this was from Justin's stepdad. He was an ex-police officer, retired police officer, and he told them that he'd found something they needed to come and have a look at. He told the detective that when Amber was round at the house, she'd been staying in the guest house, which was sort of attached, but it was a different building to the main house that he was staying in with his wife. And he kept looking out of the window and he would see Amber leave the house, leave the guest house, walk into the garden, and she'd always go to the same corner of the garden. And he saw that happen a couple of times and became a little bit suspicious, but didn't think too much of it. But when he heard that his son had been arrested and he heard that Amber was in for questioning, he started to think that something might be buried at the bottom of their garden. Whenever he had asked Amber what she was doing, going out and coming back in, she would always just say that she was going for short walks, which obviously was very suspicious. She was just going to the end of the garden and back again. So when Amber left the house, he actually went down and he saw that some rocks had been placed in quite a suspicious way. It was a way that he knew he hadn't done. He knows his garden. He knows that that's not how it usually looks. And so he moved them aside and he found a gun. Now, being an ex-police officer, he obviously knows how to handle a crime scene. So he made sure to preserve the evidence and then he called the police department. The forensics team came and recovered the gun and they put it in for testing, and they found that not only did the ballistics of the gun match, but there was also blood on it, and that blood was a match to Michael. With this information, officers went to arrest Amber, but when they arrived at her house, they discovered that she'd actually gone on the run. Amber had made it literally across the other side of the country, almost 2,500 miles away to New York. She'd been attempting to get to her grandmother's house and she very nearly made it, but she was eventually captured by police, and this time they had issued a warrant for her arrest and she was extradited back to Tucson. On the 23rd of October 2003, she was charged with first-degree murder and she refused to talk to police, and so she was given a lawyer. She pleaded not guilty to Michael's murder and the case went to trial. At trial, Amber's background was dug into a little more deeply. An individual who went to school with her said that she was quiet and oftentimes other students were pretty mean to her. All in all, she was a bit of a loner and she didn't have many friends. Amber's defense presented that Amber and Michael were arguing on the night he was killed, and Michael began to get extremely angry to the point where he became violent. Amber said that Michael had hit her, pushed her over, and even sexually assaulted her. In the midst of a struggle, she'd taken her gun out to defend herself, but Michael had taken her hand, forced it to his own head, and in quite a ridiculous story, said that Michael couldn't cope with what he'd done to her and so pulled the trigger and killed himself. But the prosecution, of course, presented a completely different version of events. They said that after the drinks with Eli on that Wednesday night, Michael and Amber had stayed for a couple more hours, eventually leaving at around midnight. They headed back to Michael's, but they were still arguing, this time about their relationship. It was apparent that Amber knew her relationship, her marriage was failing, and she saw a future with Michael. She wanted to marry him, but Michael wasn't so sure. He had been enjoying spending time with Amber, he'd been enjoying sleeping with her, but he didn't really see it going any further, certainly not to the extent of marriage. But Amber wasn't happy with that. And that's how the argument had started up again, and Amber had gotten so angry. She didn't want to be without Michael. She definitely didn't want him to end things with her, but Michael had just told her that marriage wasn't an option. They'd argued so much that he'd actually told her to get out of his life. And of course, Amber was never going to let that happen. So with these arguments that she and Michael were having, the fact that she was drunk, Michael was drunk, things were escalating, she reached into her handbag, pulled out the gun, and shot Michael there in the head, and he died instantly. The defense could bring no witnesses to the stand to testify that Michael had ever shown violent tendencies. By all accounts, his students, his colleagues, his friends and family, there was no one that could help to back up the defense's theory. In fact, they said he was completely the opposite of that. That first trial, however, ended in a mistrial, and so the second trial went ahead, and this time Amber changed her story. She said that she had been the one to go to Michael and tell him that she wanted to end things. She decided to give her and her husband another try. But she said when she tried to break it off with Michael, he got angry and he threatened her. And so in a way of defending herself, she pulled out the gun and shot him dead. It was suggested that Justin might have known about the murder when Amber had come home late that night or early on the Thursday morning. She might have told him what had happened. She wasn't quiet. She didn't say she just needed space and wasn't going to tell him why she was upset. It was suggested that Justin then may have gone back to the house and tried to help her clean up or stage it as though it had been a robbery. Remember that the front door was open and there was that smashed window with the glass that had fallen out of it. But even though the detectives presented this and thought this might be the case, it couldn't be proven and so wasn't pressed any further. On the 15th of July 2003, Amber was found guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to just 13 years in prison, and she actually was released in 2016. Michael's family were obviously not happy with the sentence that Amber had been given. Michael's eldest daughter, Brianna, said that she would miss the times that she spent with her father. He took her to the Gaslight Theatre to see plays and took her in costumes to the Renaissance Fair. She went on to say that she regrets that his grandchildren, including her son, will never see him again. Quote, "They'll never know what a wonderful person he was and the wonderful things he brought to this world." Thank you for watching this episode of Red Rum. If you enjoyed it, please click the thumbs up button. Please subscribe if you're not subscribed. And if you've got a case suggestion, pop it down below. I'll add it to the list. And I'll see you next week for another episode of Red Rum.